I am Svea. I'm the Executive Director of the Grunin Center for Law and Social Entrepreneurship. I'm joined by my colleagues, Yona Kim, who's the Director of Case Study Development, Research and Publishing, as well as Stephanie Sparks, our Program Associate. Just so you know, this is a 1-hour webinar, and we're going to have Deborah and David start by introducing themselves, and then we're going to dive right into the conversation. Please know that written materials are posted on our website, and we're going to drop a link into the chat so you can access them during the webinar or afterwards. Please use the chat and post your questions, comments. You can chat at any time. We're going to do our best to address as many questions as we can. And then for those seeking CLE credit, please record all attendance verification codes that you hear announced during the program. And then after the webinar, we will circulate 2 different links. One is going to be an attendance verification form for those who are interested in CLE credit. And then another will be a link to a survey that's for everyone. We want to find out whether folks in the room are interested in future webinars on related topics. So please fill out the post-webinar survey so we know exactly what you're interested in. And we're also going to drop those links into the chat at the end of the webinar. And while we have you here, please mark your calendars for June 4th and 5th. We look forward to welcoming all of you to NYU Law for our annual Legal Issues in Social Entrepreneurship and Impact Investing in the US and Beyond, our annual conference. And we're going to be announcing the themes for the conference later this month, so look out for that. And also mark your calendars for January 19th. Which is the deadline when applications are due for the Grunin Prize for Law and Social Entrepreneurship. So please encourage folks in your network who are working on innovative and field advancing work in social entrepreneurship and impact investing to please apply for the prize. We want to hear from all of you. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Deborah and David.
Thank you much, Svea. And David, it's so good to see you. Happy New Year to you. Yes, and Happy New Year to all of our attendees. I see that we have well over 60 already online, so that's just terrific. I'm Deborah Burand. I'm a professor at NYU Law School. As some of you know, I've been working in the fields of impact investing and or social entrepreneurship, both as a lawyer and a business person since the 1980s. Starting with my very first pro bono legal support, which was given to the world's first debt for nature swap. I now more currently am practicing in this space at NYU Law, where I founded and direct an international transactions clinic that provides pro bono legal services to social entrepreneurs and impact investors. I'm also the faculty director of the Grunin Center for Law and Social Entrepreneurship, which is sponsoring this webinar. I'd like to transition to the topic at hand. Here is a little background story. In September of 2019, I was flying to England to present some research that I've been doing on how the contractual architecture in terms of social impact bonds and development impact bonds were likely to respond to what we call exogenous shocks. Think catastrophic climate events. On the plane, I read an article in the Harvard Business Review that David had co-authored on relational contracts, where he and his co-authors provided examples of how formal relational contracting could improve and strengthen long-term, complex, interdependent business relationships. So, quick ad, this is a little backwards, but if you haven't seen this article, it's on newsstands everywhere now because it's just been reprinted in the Harvard Business Review. And I know this is backwards, but it is a special issue on how to build trust in contractual relationships. So it's so popular. This article has come back on demand. This was a real light bulb for me reading this article. Because I was seeing the business relationships of impact investors and social entrepreneurs as also long-term, complex, and interdependent. And many of the impact investors and social entrepreneurs that I was seeing firsthand every day in my clinic, and others that I was looking at through my legal scholarship, were engaging in these transactions as an expression of their values. And the question I was asking myself is, what might we as lawyers do to ensure that those values were given a place to shape and inform the contractual architecture in terms of those business transactions? That is, how do we go beyond lip service and intentions? I must admit, and David wasn't there, so he might be blushing now, but I ran around that conference at Oxford holding this article in my hand, telling everybody, you have to read this. This is really, really relevant to our work. So fast forward, spring 2023. I, out of the blue, reached out to David and his co-authors and invited them to be the opening keynote speakers at our annual conference. And to my delight, all three agreed. And that was the beginning of a conversation that David and I have been having then and now, sharing with you in this webinar on relational contracting. How a relational contracting approach can be used by impact investors and social entrepreneurs to ensure that the values that drew them to this business relationship actually shapes how that relationship unfolds. And of particular interest to many of us working in these fields, how can relational contracting ensure that the interest of non-contracting parties, and in this case, I'm thinking of the intended beneficiary communities and stakeholders, remain front and center over the life of a transaction? So that's the conversation I am hoping we're going to be engaging in today, and have really enjoyed the conversation that David and I have been having ever since our meeting each other in person in June last year. So David, let me hand it to you.
Thanks, Deborah. I'm so happy that you reached out there last spring, and I attended the conference and look forward to come back this year. So hi everyone, nice to meet you all. As you can hear, I'm not from the United States. I'm actually from Sweden. So I'm a Swedish business attorney working at a law firm called Serial Law Firm. We are a mid-sized Swedish law firm providing business advice in all areas of law to Swedish and international clients. My background, my focus for the past 10 years, apart from relational contract, has been more in supply chain, in outsourcing, etc. So I'm now, to a growing extent, I'm moving into the sustainability area. But I'm not I have done a lot of M&A, etc. over the years, but I'm not an expert in impact investments. But I'm doing that now. I'm going to tell you about the project I'm working on right now, just to give an example of what the relational contract is. So, but when you reached out, Deborah, I had been working with what we now call formal relational contracts for some 10 years. And my co-authors, you mentioned them. One of them was Kate Witasek at the University of Tennessee, and her vested model. I had discovered that, I think, 2012. So she was one of the co-authors, and the other is Oliver Hart, who's won the Nobel Prize in 2016, I think, in economics, on his work on incomplete contract. And you have written some great stuff based on his work also, Deborah, I know. So and I sort of put those brilliant minds together and added myself, and that was a good recipe for having an article published in the Harvard Business Review. And it's great to see it's out now again. So, and I don't think I will, talk more about myself. Let's move to the subject here. So, back to you. Back to you, then.
So for the next 50 minutes, we're going to talk about the substantive conversation about what, in fact, relational contracting is and how it could be applied to the fields of impact investing and social entrepreneurship. So let me start by asking you this question, David. Would you tell us a little bit more about what relational contracting is and how it differs from more commercial or traditional contractings? That'll sort of help ground us in this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a good question. So let me share my, let's hope this works now. We tested it before, but let me share my screen. So I usually, when I talk about this, I also teach this. I have done for many years at the University of Tennessee and others. I think a good way to describe what the relational contract is to compare it to the more traditional contract that we call a transactional contract. And we have these five dimensions here: focus, relationship, risk management, social norms, and planning. And I think I will use this slide to answer your question then. As you can see, it's a continuum. It's not really black or white. which I think is important to emphasize. Let me just also, before going through this, tell you a bit about, to give some more meat on the bones, so to say, a project which actually is an impact investment I'm working on right now. So it's a Swedish impact fund who is our client, and they are going to finance a municipality in Sweden, a project. In this municipality, there is a common problem in many Western countries. The cost and expenses for elderly care is increasing as the population grows older. And this is becoming an increasing challenge for many municipalities, but not least this one, because when they also compare their cost levels, etc., to other comparable municipalities, it seems like, well, no, their costs are higher for this. So they have to initiate the project, but they also lack funding because the budgets are decreasing instead of increasing. So now our clients and the municipalities engaged in the discussion, how can our client fund this project? So it's a kind of one of those projects where I think a relational contract is a good example here. Now I just want to have that as a background. If we look at, the first thing here, focus in a transactional contract, and which is the traditional contract that most of us typically work with, the focus is very much on the deal as such. What is going to be paid, what services are going to be provided, what activities are going to be carried out, etc., and in remuneration for some payment or something like that. And this would have been, in this case with the municipality, of course, then this would have been a more traditional loan agreement specifying in detail exactly this is the rights to draw the funds. The funds are going to be used for this and only this and that, etc. And if this or that happens, then the fund can withdraw the money, etc. And that would be the heart and center of the contract. But in a relational contract, this is different, because now we know that this is a highly complex project, as one of those that you mentioned that you thought about on the plane, Deborah. So it's hard to predict exactly what will have to happen in order for the elderly care to improve. So instead of focusing so much on the transaction, it is important, but we focus more on the relationship, actually. And we do this by, in the contract, stating what is the problem to be solved, what is the shared vision and goals and objectives of the parties to reach. This is an outcome-based deal also. And I will talk about those. What are the norms or guiding principles that the parties will use in their relationship, and how will we govern the relationship, not least. There's much more focus on that. Then, of course, the transaction is important, of course, but it's more like you embed a transaction that can also evolve over time as people learn, as the parties learn what works and what doesn't work. And you embed that into a relationship which will remain constant over time. So that's the first dimension and the first part reply to your question here, Deborah. Then, of course, in the second dimension, all contracts establish some kind of relationship, but in a traditional contract, this would be more of an arm's length relationship. If it was you and I, Deborah, having a contract, I would say, well, this is what you should do and not do, and I should do this and not do that, and I don't really care about your interests. That's more up to you to take care of your own interests, etc. So more arm's length. Whereas in a relational contract, this is a used and abused and misused term, but there is no better term than partnership. That is what we try to build instead, also in this case with the fund and a municipality, where the parties really want to consider each other's interest. And also, as we referred to, now we have the interesting, the beneficiaries here also, which are the elders. They are, of course, not included in the contract, but they are of course, some part of this.
Can I just jump in here?
Yeah,
so when you put the word partnership, you are not meaning a legal partnership, you're meaning a relational partnership.
No. Yeah. So this is a paradox, of course, in the contract, because we say it's a partnership, so to say, and then we also have that mandatory clause saying this is not a partnership, this is not a legal partnership. But that is the way it is. But so it's not a legal partnership. Good question. And then, of course, risk management. All contracts, also relational contracts, of course, are about managing risk. But in a traditional contract, and this is also a risk of the parties running into conflicts of interest and and doing bad stuff to one another to the detriment of the deal. So, and in traditional contracts, you deal with risks basically through power. And what I mean by that is that the contract is enforceable, so that you can use state power. If you don't do what I tell you, Deborah, or what's in the contract, I can take you to court, or I may leave you, or I may threat to leave you to use someone else instead, and then that's some kind of market power that I use. And this is, of course, important, and the enforceability is, of course, a part of the relational contract also. But here we move more to the root cause of the problem, and that is that we may have aligned or misaligned interests. So we try to instead ask another question: how can we create a deal where we have continuously aligned interests and expectations over time? And that's a quite different question that we ask. And again, we do this by focusing much more on what is to be achieved, how we're going to measure that, how we're going to govern our relationships so we can have our interests and expectations aligned over time, etc. And this is, we can come back to that, but this is often a much more efficient way of aligning interest than the use of power, because typically I won't take you to court, Deborah. So the traditional mechanism is often quite weak. And then also, referring back to your plane ride there, you thought about the values, Deborah, and this is, of course, the social norms. This is one of the secret sauces in the relational contract. And in a traditional contract, and if we had written this kind of traditional contract between the fund and the municipality, it would have been quite disconnected from social norms. And what I mean by that is fairness, and in a traditional contract, it's okay to tell white lies and to use your power to your advantage and not really look out for each other's interests. Not to act in ways which would not make you popular among your friends and family, but it's totally okay in the business environment. In the relational contract, we take the totally opposite approach. I mean, there's a lot of research showing that more complex commercial and social relationships, which are, for lack of better words, characterized by a high degree of morality, they overperform. What is that kind of morality? So what we do here is that we transform social norms into contractual obligations, and there are actually 6 what we call guiding principles, these are those 6 that we actually have put words to, and the parties discuss them and put words to, and we include them in the contract. It's reciprocity, to give and take. It's autonomy, that is to not use power, but to let the parties make autonomous decisions. Honesty, quite obvious what that is. Loyalty, to have this obligation to look out for each other's interests and actually consider each other's interests to be equally important. Equity, that's how our interpretation of that term here is. It's about proportionality, how right proportions between the risks taken and potential upside, etc. And then also, finally, integrity, which is a consistency norm, binding all these norms together. And we can come back to this also when we discuss the process, Deborah, how to use this. But this is a critical part of this, because we also actually use these norms to interpret the contracts. All contracts are incomplete. And definitely this contract between the fund and the municipality will be incomplete. There will be a lot of things that the parties have not thought about. And here these guiding principles can come in and help the parties to fill in the blanks, so to say. And then the last dimension here is planning. Of course, you need to plan in all contracts, plan for the future. But I mean, in a transaction contract, the ambition is to make a complete plan and to try to provide for all contingencies over the term of the contract, right? And that's, of course, is an illusionary approach, but this is still at least the unconscious aim of most people that write contract. In the relational contract, we just embrace the fact that this will be an incomplete incomplete contract, and let's try to make more of a flexible framework. That scares some lawyers a bit, but this, it is a flexible framework anyway because it will be incomplete. So let's just deal with that fact, and then focus very much, as I said, on the relationship and create that firm framework, and then make a deal within which the parties, so that can evolve over time between the parties.
It's interesting,
this
David.
Is a quick version, Deborah, quick 5-10 minutes version of the response to what is a relational contract.
It's interesting because in some of the research I've been doing with Louise Savelle out of social finance in the UK, we've been looking at some incomplete contracting going on. And one of the things that we've observed that during COVID, those agreements that did embrace the incompleteness did have values that had been expressed in the negotiation, actually made for not only a fair and balanced and flexible framework, but they were more resilient. They didn't break. And when you're trying to do hard things, as we do in impact investing, where there's lots of multiple factors that could take you forward or derail you, having resiliency built into the contractual architecture can be quite important. So let me just re-ask this question to you. If you were to sort of say, what are the characteristics of contracts that are particularly well suited to this relational contracting approach, how would you answer that?
But I think it's what you said in your introduction. When you have, it comes back very much to the incompleteness, and the incompleteness increases as the term of the contract. The longer the term of the contract, and the more the complexity increases, and also that the risk increases. And this means that there's a number of contracts out there. Of course, what we talk about here in impact investing for beneficial social outcomes, that's a good example, because that can be indeed be long-term and very complex. But also in other in service provisions, in shareholders agreements, and in construction contracts, I have worked mainly in the private sector, also with construction contracts, etc. So everything long-term, complex, is at least a candidate for this kind of. I'm not saying that you should always use them. You have to have the right maturity, etc. But they are a good candidate to consider at least.
And when you say interdependent, one of the things that I've been thinking about, but I'd like your thoughts, is it's not only that the parties need each other deeply for this project to work, and the transaction cost of looking for another partner are steep, and the economic leakage that could occur is steep. But often it seems to me that this works well where there is an ongoing relationship. This is maybe not the only contractual relationship these parties will enter into. When I was reading your article, which was really about supply and services, it wasn't just about, okay, let's get the buns to McDonald's on March 3rd. It was, and June 3rd, and August 3rd. There's an ongoing relationship, and so that long-term could be a long-term relationship, not just a long-term contract. Is that?
No, that's a good example. And when of course you can have a long-term contract, but you never meet. But the more frequently the parties engage with one another, that is also an important aspect. And then typically, as we know, in traditional contracts, we have the written contract, or the paper deal, as we call it, is typically then transactional, can be quite one-sided, etc. But since the parties do actually meet and engage, they informally develop, much of these kinds of behaviors still. But this is one of the reasons why we think there's a risk there, because then you have this distinction, what we call the difference between the paper deal, which is transaction contract, and the real deal, which can be a quite good relationship. But that makes, you spoke about resilience here, that creates a danger actually for the relationship, because then it only means that, well, one of the parties, key personnel, can leave the contract, or there can be those shocks, etc. And all of a sudden, the parties then start to look into the contract, which is a transactional contract, and it will not provide sufficient resilience for the parties then.
Mm-hmm. David, I don't know if you want to go to your next slide, last slide, or if we should go out of the PowerPoint so that we can see each other better.
Yeah, it was about the process, if you wanted to discuss that.
Go ahead and say a word about the process, because I think there's some folks that are also interested in hearing about not only how you put these together, but what are the benefits of making it formal and possibly enforceable.
Yeah, so let me just speak briefly about this, because what we have realized also is that, and there are several secret sources here. One of those are the guiding principles that I mentioned before, but it's also that, I mean, the process as such for entering into this contract, or even as, almost as important as the contract itself, because actually what we try to do in this municipality project with the fund and municipality, we came in a bit late, but they have been good at building their relationships, but we have not been able to follow this process, but I think we can manage that. But if we do it by the book, so to say, then it's important. Now it's a relational contract, and focus is on the relationship, and that means that we start by laying the foundation and discuss things like trust and transparency, and are we compatible, can we work together, etc. You move on to start to focus on what are we going to achieve together, this shared vision and the objectives. Maybe you go into some measurements and KPIs, etc. And you have these discussions and discover, so to say, and adopt these guiding principles and say, well, this sounds like good values to create as a foundation for our partnership. And it's only when you have done that you actually move into sort of the deal, so to say. Mm-hmm. It's called here align expectations and interests. And this is quite interesting because then if this is done right, this is not a negotiation actually. I mean, in step 4, you would typically start there and then you would have a negotiation. But now this is much more of a co-creation and a discussion, because starting with these first 3 steps, the parties really become involved in this, what we call a what's in it for we mindset, etc. So it's much more of a joint problem solving than in step 4. And then in step 5 is to stay aligned, and that's sort of setting up this important governance structure. How are we going to engage? How are we going to communicate? How are we going to deal with? I mean, there will be some misalignments and friction, etc. How we're going to deal with that, etc. So the process here is critical also for success.
So it's interesting, David. One of the things I would say in my experience is that I've seen, as I look at your 5-step process, I've seen a lot of those steps being used by folks that are engaging in impact investing, or where the party may be a social entrepreneur that is providing the service, or maybe the principal, not the agent. Mm. What I continue to struggle with is the value of the formality of this, as opposed to the more informal approaches that I'm seeing. Can you say a bit more about that, and maybe what you've seen happen when these relationships have been tested with? Yeah.
No, and I think there are multiple responses. I also see a question here in the chat regarding challenges that you have seen to the enforceability of relational contracts. Mm-hmm. You can actually ask that question also. So I see several benefits. There's another great law professor in Toronto, Gillian Hadfield, and she has written some articles where she speaks about or writes about contract as a scaffold. And I really like that concept or metaphor, or what you want to call it, because this kind of contract, to have it formal, if you don't have it formal, if it's only informal, then, as I said, then you might live in this, and this is quite common, as you know, that you have this, the paper deal is a written contract, and then you have a real deal, which is a quite good relationship, quite informal, etc. But when things go wrong, then you really have nothing to hold on to. And it can be easily that, you know, there's a new sheriff in town coming into the contract, or some people leave, etc. And then they you know, they may want to look into the contract, and they can read that this is for their benefit, and then all of a sudden they just destroy everything. So I say it's a bit provocative, but I sometimes say also these kind of contracts, you write them partly to protect you from the other party, but equally much to protect you from yourself. Actually, I mean, so that is one of the benefits of having it formal. I think it's also symbolic value. I mean, if I only tell you, Deborah, that I will be honest with you, that has some effect. But then I say, I now sign a contract that I will be honest with you. You can feel that there is a difference. That doesn't have a really legal meaning, but it has a behavioral difference. So I think that's important. But then, of course, also, I think, I mean, going back to this question regarding the enforceability of relational contracts, because I think for me, that's not so complicated. These guiding principles, you can say that that's just a way of interpreting what is sort of, you know, what's it called? I mean, the duty of fair dealings, right? So what does that really mean? And obviously, US courts and also UK courts have now said that there is a duty to for you know, for such fair dealings with one another, and that is, you know, so you can use this as interpreting the contract, and to use it in that way. So I don't think that there's so much discussion. Of course, I think this is enforceable, but I think so there's legal value to it. It's sort of symbolic value. It's behavioral, etc. So many benefits of having it formal, I think.
So
does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I want to talk a little bit about the communication aspects of this, because it's when you, as I've read more of your work, and you wrote a really interesting piece more recently with Oliver Hart. Always nice to be able to attach yourself to a Nobel Prize winning economist, David. I'm very envious. But you really talk deeply about the need for deep communication and how that so I've looked at impact investments where people said, we're not going to be binary. You do this. If you don't, we will do this. If you do this, we're going to give you this. But people that are starting to say, you know what, it's not that black and white. And we really are getting interesting data about whether we're meeting our mark on the impact goals. We're using impact measurements that have been very deeply thought about. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how bringing impact data into these arrangements, how that can shape what communication looks like over the course of the life of a transaction. Because it's not just sort of at the end of the day, did it work? I think people are trying to find ways to be getting impact data, and the outcome data may not be till much later, but at least the output or the input impact metrics information is flowing through this. How do people as they build communication strategies, how do they build that into these maintaining an alignment of interest and getting in front of issues?
No, it's a great question. I think there are several aspects to this. First of all, I think if you just start with communication in general, again, also research in behavioral economics and other areas show again that not only sort of high degree of morality improves things, but just communication also improves the relationship and improves outcome. But that can also be just soft communication. How are you today, Deborah? And what did you eat for lunch, etc. So that is also important. But which may not be that common in many contractual relationships, actually, to really care for each other. So I think that's an important part of this, and also what we try to sort of lay the foundations for in the relational contract. But more to your specific question, the communication piece and the data piece are quite critical. It's not necessary to have those contracts the business model to be outcome based, but the approach is very much outcome or output based, because to align interests, you have to share some common goals. We have to have an interest in walking in the same direction, so to say. And then is what we do there is, we can think of, we start kind of quite abstract level with the vision, as I said. You break it down into more specific objectives. What does it or goals? What does it really mean? And then from there, you should typically also go in sort of have some kind of KPIs, not KPIs necessarily to control one another.
And by that you mean key performance indicators.
Exactly. Sorry. Yeah. Key performance metrics to measure, are we reaching these goals? Are we achieving success together? And then also to be quite granular about how are we going to measure this and who is going to measure, what data will we use, etc. And this is important because, what will happen then is that you will get much more clarity, aligned view of where we're going, and much more clarity. And this is sort of not sort of fuzzy communication. It can be laser sharp. And that, of course, helps parties to avoid misunderstandings, etc. So both though they sort of the soft part and the hard part of the communication, they sort of support one another, if you know what I mean.
It also allows for course corrections, right?
Yes.
If they're necessary. Because I think one of the things I was struggling with as I was sitting on that plane was I had seen people setting up contractual governance provisions where they just routinized, we're going to meet every certain period of time. We're going to talk about where we are. We're going to be looking at some of these impact measurements that are coming in real time. And then, and also things that maybe bumps in the road, and reflecting on it and wondering if we've got the right people at the table or whether we need to bring someone else in. And the data that's coming in, we're going to have some people that are independent of the interest of the parties here telling us that's accurate. All of that sounded great to me, but I kept saying, but how then do they make their decisions? So all of these elements have been set out, but then what do we do with it? And that's where I started to realize that this idea of really being clear about what success would look like and what we're all trying to achieve here, and being very clear about how we will behave with each other as we start to assimilate this information, how powerful that could be. And I wonder if you could give a quick example, and then we're going to move to additional questions that are coming in on the chat. But if you could give an example of how that's happened in a commercial context, where you've actually seen people really struggling with something hard and having to shift.
No, it's a great question, and this is part of this. What I said is being a flexible framework, because sort of, it's flexible, but there is also a framework, and the framework is that what you said now. To be very clear on the goals and the values and behaviors and how the structure for communication, etc. But then to be flexible within that framework. And what I have seen, when we have done these deals, is that the parties may also realize, the pricing model that we created, we didn't fail completely, but we realize now that it really provides some perverse incentives here. So what I have seen many times, that the parties realize this, and then of course then that also means that it will be more advantageous for one party than the other party. But both parties, since we have in this relation contract, they realize that, it may be great for me now, but it may not be great later. And I also know if it's only great for me, but not for you, then we'll be a lot of friction, etc. So then the parties adapt and change the contract. Because they know that this is what will benefit the long-term goals that they have. And I couldn't give you a better example than that, because then it's really about the money. And still people behave like that. So I think that's quite strong.
And I've also seen, and then I want to open this up to Svea, who I think is monitoring the chat room, to throw some questions at us, or Una. I've seen people leaning into, in our space, leaning into these type of relationships to also give voice to the beneficiaries. And sort of saying, look, whoever is closest to the beneficiaries who can really tell us about how their needs may have shifted, maybe because of an exogenous event like COVID, that if we're really here about helping them, being dogmatically tied to one particular outcome or one particular service may actually not be as relevant. And so it gives room and space for people to make an informed decision. They may choose not to go that route, but at least to have the conversation. So it's another way maybe to bring beneficiary interest front and center in these. If that is part of the party's intentions, right? It's not just to help this group in a particular way. It's to help them as their needs are shifting as well. Svea or Una, are there additional questions that you think we should start responding to that have been coming into the chat?
Yes, I'll give you one, which is actually two parts. How do you get parties to shift their thinking from a traditional transactional approach to the relational approach? And then the second part of that question, are there some examples of relational contracts that you can share with us?
That's for you, David.
Yeah, sure. No, I think, I mean, as for the first question, this is more easy than you can think, actually. And then the secret to that is to follow that process. I think I just came from South Africa. That's the cradle of humankind. I think we're genetically coded to cooperate somehow. Otherwise, we wouldn't, be dominating the earth right now. So I think it's when the parties start in the right place and start to discuss, okay, now we are about to engage in this project together, and let's start to talk about sort of what does trust mean for us, transparency, do we have compatible values in our organizations and things like that. Then it feels very natural, and then you move into the next step. So let's set up a shared vision together, and that's just really engaging for the parties. And all of a sudden, sort of you're part of that. That's a new game. So of course, the trick is to get the parties to the table to start those discussions at first, and that can be a bit challenging sometimes. But I think if you do that, then it's a quite quick process to get this new game going.
I would even hazard to say that it could, in some instances, be a gating process, meaning as we see more and more players come into this field, if they are resistant to these types of conversations, I think it's an opportunity for people to say, do we have the right people at the table? Because if they are unwilling and unable to engage in these conversations now, what's going to happen when things don't go to plan?
Yeah.
And that's a harsh thing to say. Yet, I think some people that I've talked to in our space say to me, getting the right people at the table, the right parties, the right interest, and discerning that is so important. And the sooner you can realize that there may not be, even at the outset, a true alignment of values, then you may want to rethink who you've got there at the table.
Yeah. No, I like Kate Witasek. She says, change the people or change the people. That's even a harsher way to say it. But I think, I like that. As for the second question, I'm an attorney, so I have sort of client privilege, so I don't have really sort of to share. But I think there are some. I was just thinking whether there are some public authorities, I mean, that may have uses in the United States, that could be possible. And I could maybe if this person emails me and I can get back to that question. Let's see if there are more questions.
Yeah, I also will say, and this is a plug that David's not giving himself, but they do put some really interesting examples in the book that he wrote with Oliver and Kate. My copy is very dog-eared because I keep going back to it. And in some cases, what's interesting, it's not just private sector parties, but government agencies have made themselves amenable to this approach, which, as someone who used to be the general counsel of a government agency here in the United States, I find really quite interesting. So, Svea, anything else that is coming?
Yes, we have a few more. Is the process of relational contracting necessarily more costly and lengthy?
Oh, yeah, great question. Necessarily? No, I don't think so. It's, in my view, it's can even be quite often be cheaper and less expensive actually, because if you sit, and it of course depends on the context. I'm more used to sort of the private sector, but then if you do a transactional contract, and if you're a buyer, for example, then you plan and sit with your internal project for months before you go out to the market, and then find some suppliers, and you start negotiating, etc. And with this approach, you do, you important to become quite clear on what do we want to achieve, etc. But you start to engage the market much earlier, and etc. And then you spend much more time discussing relevant stuff instead of sort of arguing about things and having kind of a war between one another in those harsh negotiations. So actually, I think it's equally or even more efficient in my experience.
I could see it being very useful for those who want to have a pilot relationship, to test the waters. I could see how using this relational contracting, it could be very helpful to create a pilot where people are still sort of figuring out what the there is, whether they've got the correct impact measurements, whether they've got the right parties at the table, and so making sure that your pilot actually is going to give you the learnings that you're seeking. Going through this process could help you figure out, okay, that's why that pilot didn't work, or that's why this pilot did work. So again, it's back to the ways of getting yourself faster to the scale of impact that you want to have.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Next question, Deborah, your question about beneficiaries is key for one of the attendees, because it's always a headache to the parties and projects that involve government and private sector. And then we get political interference or change of interest. So how does one get around this? And that's from Nomazulu Sibanda.
I'm not sure when you say get around this, what we're meaning, but I will say that I think this is a space for a lot more sharing and a lot more learning. I think that we have paid a little bit of short shrift to being as focused on beneficiary interest and discerning those as and have spent more time on impact measurements that are somehow divorced from that. And I think the more that we can link these conversations together, so that as we are evaluating the effects of our transactions, we are also maintaining curiosity and a learning mindset, is something that we need to lean into. And I found it quite interesting in the research I was doing about those more flexible agreements that survived the pandemic, who pivoted because they realized their beneficiaries needed something different. And I've seen examples in impact bonds doing that. I've seen examples in social franchises doing that, where they started to realize, you know what, we need to think about who we are delivering services to differently. And those that had a learning mindset were the ones that had that too. So when I sort of think of shared vision and values, I think curiosity about the beneficiary experiences has got to be really high, at least on my list.
And I don't think I have that much to add, and I'm sure Nomazulu has much more experience with having this challenge than I have. Just one idea that comes to mind is that it seems like a great risk to have political interference if you do it sort of ad hoc and not sort of. But if you do this, if you build it into the governance structure and have this in a systematic way, to sort of a yearly review or something like that, and I think that may be this sort of the question sparks those kind of thoughts for.
Yeah, I will also say, and I'm hoping that we engage in this in our conference this coming year. There's been some really interesting sociological studies about when you invite views of a beneficiary population to be expressed, are you actually shaping the beneficiary experience in ways that you did not intend to?
Yeah.
And so I think there is a lot we could learn from an interdisciplinary approach to this so that we don't end up, and maybe I say this because I used to work in the microfinance field, and I felt that at times we had taught our clients what to tell us. And yes, this loan will be used for working capital. Yes, the people who are going to control the money in our household are the women. I mean, they knew what to tell us. And when we were not curious enough about whether that was really happening, we sometimes created products or inadvertent problems for the people we were really trying to serve.
No, I think that's important. I didn't say this, but I also have a master's degree in sociology, and this is sort of a classic thing, right? The researchers shaping the respondents by asking questions, projecting their worldview on the sort of the subjects being researched, etc. I think this is and you and I have discussed this, Deborah, that this is an area to explore more, and how can we use also relational contracts to help this, which I think it has good potential, but there's more development to be done here, I think.
So Svea, I'll give you one last question, but then I'd like to sort of move to where we're headed next. Is there any other questions?
We won't be able to get to all the questions. So this is the final one. Is there a designated structure for, or recommended structure for third parties to participate in the process of impact measurement to ensure that it's done properly, as opposed to the main parties being responsible for that?
Yeah, and I would point the person who asked that question to looking at the pay for performance contracts that are going on in the world right now, where there has been this idea of self-reporting among contracting parties. They are moving, there might be some part that's self-reporting, but when it comes to evaluating impact outcomes, they are often recruiting and bringing into the room independent evaluators, and that is something that I think we need to take a look at too. And how do you keep the costs down? How do you make sure that they are qualified? But that is happening. So there may be lessons to be learned from those who are involved in these pay for performance contracts, where the payments are positively correlated to the outcomes that are being achieved. So with that, and I know that's a short answer to a bigger question, so let me give you guys this option. First, David, thank you. I'm so glad that you were willing to make visible these conversations you and I have been having, so that others can see how we're challenging each other and challenging our sense of what lawyers could be doing in this space as we advise our clients who are involved in social entrepreneurship and impact investing. And there's certainly, as we can see from the questions, a lot more we could talk about. We could talk more about how we embed guiding principles into the negotiation processes and approaches with real detail. We could talk more about how you embed these guiding principles into the contractual governance of decision-making during the life of a transaction, and really look into, what does governance look like? What can you make happen? I think we could be talking about how to refine and reimagine contractual provisions to ensure that they're consistent with these contracting parties' guiding principles. I've seen some instances during COVID where people put a lot of fabulous thought into how they were going to meet, how they were going to assess what was going on, and then they bolted on boilerplate force majeure provisions that were at best just not useful. And at worst, became reference points for actually encouraging behaviors that nobody really wanted. I think we could talk a lot more about how to create a relational contract that looks at these guiding principles when things don't go to plan, and how to make sure those principles result in more resiliency. And something we haven't talked about, but I think I would love to spend more time thinking about and discussing, is how to embed these guiding principles when you're winding down a business relationship, either as planned or because it just needs to terminate. You can't get there from here. And how do you, we have a lot of conversations about responsible exits. How could relational contracting shape responsible exits? So for our audience members, we are going to be sending a survey to you immediately after this webinar to get your feedback on today's session. But we're also going to ask you whether you'd like to continue to engage in this conversation in other webinars over the coming months on these topics that are of most interest to you. Some of the ones I have shared just now, some have come in through the chat, or there may be some that you wake up tonight and say, oh my gosh, I really would like to hear more about this. So let me now turn this over to the Grennan Center staff for their very last announcements.
Very last announcements. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your active participation. Thank you for the chat. And if you're looking for CLE credit, don't forget to fill out the CLE form. We will be dropping a link to that here in the chat, but also sending it out by email, as well as the link to the survey that Deborah just mentioned. We recorded this, as you know, so we're going to be posting the recording on our website. So please feel free to share with your network. We would love for more folks to join us in this community. And while I have you here, in case you're different folks than when we started, I'm going to use this as a reminder for our conference, our annual conference. Please mark your calendars for June 4th and 5th. We will be selecting our themes and topics later this month, so look out for that announcement. Make sure you follow us on LinkedIn. That's where we post regularly, most regularly there. And also mark your calendar for January 19th, because that is the deadline for folks to submit applications for the Grunin Prize for Law and Social Entrepreneurship. So please encourage folks in your network who are working on innovative legal issues and field advancing work in social entrepreneurship and impact investing. We want to hear from them. So thank you again.